Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is Check Yourself, self-editing for games writers. A lot of times we do panels for how to get into Paizo freelancing, how to improve your writing, and we don't do a lot of sharing our editor side of things. So we're excited to talk to you a little bit about that today. I'm Simone Salee. I am one of the senior editors here at Paizo. I've been on staff for about a year, but freelancing with the team for several years prior to that. And next up is Sol, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sol St. John. I'm another one of the editors. I've been at Paizo for almost 3 years now, and editing in general for, 8, I think, off and on, yeah.
Awesome. And Sol is also our fearless organized play leader. So they are the mastermind behind all of our org play editing and keeps that afloat. So we're happy to have you. James, go ahead.
Hi, I'm James Case. I'm senior designer on the Pathfinder rules and lore team, but I first joined Paizo as an editor right before the second edition playtest launch, and before that I was editing for about 4 years, so they let me stick around and sometimes have comments on commas and that sort of thing.
Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, hi, I'm Patrick Hurley. I'm the managing editor at Paizo. I've been with the company also for, I guess, closing in on 4 years, and I've been editing for a few years before that. Also, outside of work, a published science fiction writer with about 40 stories to my name, and and I have a very awesome team, and some former editors who are on other teams we miss very much, and they're always welcome in the chat.
Yes. Very glad to have some former contributors because once an editor, those skills don't go away. So we love seeing that from other teams. And I think a lot of people, we're going to start a little bit just by talking about what editing is, what it entails. I know the perception that a lot of folks, myself included, before I got into it, have about editing is that you are reading material and looking for typos. And that's not wrong. That is a huge part of it. But there are a lot of other layers involved, a lot of other things that we do in addition to looking for misspellings and commas in the wrong place. Those things revolve around checking for clarity, checking for consistency, elevating the material. We all know sometimes our first drafts are a little rough, and as we go through the process as writers, they get stronger, and then editors can also help you strengthen your writing even more. And of course, there's also inclusivity, sensitivity reading, all of those things fall under stronger language and editing as well. So James, if you want to start talking about the clarity and consistency part of that.
Yeah, of course. If you're writing in RPGs, it's this very interesting kind of format where you have all of this world building lore, these things you see a lot in, novels or prose work. But you also have descriptions of abilities or of, characters or what happens if, the party goes down corridor A, what monster is there. That's really a lot closer to kind of like a technical writing. And you want to be sure that your material is evocative and flavorful and doesn't sound exactly like a textbook. But you also want to be sure that that the end reader knows kind of how they're supposed to implement the mechanics and the rules within the game. So I think one thing that you can look at in terms of editing for clarity is, are you getting the idea of the rules across to the reader in kind of the most efficient way? In a way that also tells the story of what's happening. I think that when you look at people who get really excited about a spell, it's usually not just, X d6 damage. It's, a majestic plume of flame descends down and reduces everything to ash. And then you're like, oh yeah, that's much cooler than just how much numbers is happening. So yeah, it's about kind of putting that together and trying to get the idea of the technical meaning across without kind of compromising the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Patrick or Sol, anything else you want to add to that?
One thing I think is, if you're looking at putting rules language, is that the Archives of Nethys is your friend. Because there are certain, when you're doing mechanics and rules language, the text exists as it is for a reason, like, so there's no room for ambiguity or doubt. So if you're describing a mechanic in a spell or a monster or something, and you look for how it's described on one of our previously published books, which you can find through Archives of Nethys, or if you already own it, it's not a bad thing to replicate rules language exactly. There are places to get creative, but when you're describing mechanics, aside from a couple sentences in the beginning, you actually want to be pretty dry and use as precise language as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think consistency is maybe a big thing there. If you have the effect and say that this is a curse effect and that has a certain weight within the game, and then you have something else you want to function very similarly and you call it a jinx effect, and then you have something else and you want to call it a misfortune. Introducing those kind of different words makes it unclear if you intend, you the author intend this to function differently, whether you intend it to function the same. So kind of coming down and being really consistent with your language. And this is, I think, true also just in technical writing in general. But if you mean thing A and you kind of develop a consistent way that you talk about it, when the reader starts to see it, they'll be like, oh yeah, I know this effect. I saw this in a cool thing that came out last year, and now this is an evolution of that. So I totally get it already.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but one of the notes that we have in one of our documents internally is about remembering that checks are not the agent. And so being really intentional and specific with what language you're choosing. The die roll is not doing the action your player characters are or your NPCs are. And so remembering that, being as specific and technical as possible is also meant to just support your characters in feeling like they're driving the story rather than waiting to see what happens to them, because they can go read a book if that's what they want to do. James, you also had an example in the sheet. I don't know if you want to share that in particular, if you're saving that for later, about the queen.
Oh yes, this is one of my favorite sentences, which is
Yes.
A lot of the time when you're writing something, you know what you want to say. So I think I forget who I got this from, but it's the line when the queen screamed at her handmaiden, she was scared. And I don't know if like the queen is scared and that's why she's screaming, or if the handmaiden is scared because someone just yelled at her. So this idea of kind of what Simone was talking about, and especially in a role-playing game, where you are role-playing as a character, being very clear who the agent is. Whether if you say, if the party rolls a success on the check to cross the bridge, nothing bad happens. And you're like, well, is that one person in the party? Is that like the party collectively designates it? Is it like everybody rolls? And that can help, especially in when you're telling a story with the mechanics the way we do in adventures a lot of the time. And Sol, I know you work a lot in the OP scenario, so you might have some insight on this. That can really keep things very tight, and then you can have more words for describing cool set pieces or the environment or somebody's personality.
Yes, 100%. That word count that we have to keep in mind as well. Like sometimes you do need more words in order to explain something and reduce ambiguity. But when you can be really concise about it, that frees up so much more. Sol, did you want to add anything to that, or should we slide to our next piece?
That's pretty much what I was thinking as well. What I was thinking to say was that consistency is also something to keep in mind when it comes to not just the technical stuff, but also the narrative text. It's something you're keeping in mind when it comes to the consistency of the narrative. Like, you don't really think about it when you're writing, but when you're editing, you have to pay attention to consistency of like the names, not just the spelling, but making sure that everybody's names are kept in order, and consistency of like character, especially when you're working from like one adventure, if you've got adventures that click together, like an adventure path, or if you've got an OP scenario where you've got an NPC that recurs multiple times, it can be important for the consistency of the character to feel the same every time they show up. Consistency of just how the narrative flows together, and all these things that you're trying to keep in mind while reading through things is, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point about crossing over adventures too, because we do have so many different authors that work on every piece internally and in our freelancers, and then you might have a bunch of different people writing AP volumes, or a character reappear in a future season of an org play scenario, and so there's only so much you can do as the author, because all authors do have different voices. And so as editors, since we do see everything come through, a lot of our work, exactly like Soul said, is to kind of make sure like these characters have the same feel and have the same, ways of speaking. And little details like somebody standing up to say something, but you also said that they stood up, a paragraph ago. So consistency really shows up in all of those different places. Yeah. I'm sure we will have other examples pop in, but if you want to kind of take that into elevating the material, Patrick, we can start talking about that piece too.
Sure. So, it's interesting. With rules language, I think consistency and repetition are fine. You're supposed to use that because you want to use the same terms to describe the same rules, just as James was describing, like jinx and bad luck or something like that. But when it comes to narrative text or read aloud text, you actually want to watch out for that kind of unintended word echo, is what I call it, and or unintended word repetition. You want to pay attention to the rhythm of your sentences. You want to be as precise as possible and use as accurate language as possible. So there are parts, I think that's why writing for games is so interesting, because it's half science and precision and thinking about balance and mechanics, and then half art where you're trying to make everything sound super fascinating and pretty, because you want to draw the people in and help the GM, give the GM as many tools to make the world come alive as possible. One of the most helpful things, I use it in my own fiction. I use it when we're editing adventures, especially if I'm trying to break down what something's saying. Is I honestly, if you're writing for us or any game, reading your stuff aloud after a first or second draft, I think is one of the best ways to catch unintended word echo, awkward phrases. Oh, I'd already said this here, and now I'm saying it again here. It can be long doing that. So there are tools too where you could, free online tools where you could just paste in your text and have like a robot read it back to you in various voices, which are free if you don't want to read so out loud for so long. But if I were going to give one tip to any aspiring freelancers, it's read your drafts back to yourself out loud.
Yes, I think that's one of my number ones as well, because you spend so much time when you're writing, especially on a deadline. You have a lot of words to get through. You spend so much time with the material, and so it's going to start to look and sound right in your head, even if maybe there's a word missing, or we see echoes all the time. And even though Patrick talked about this, I'm going to say a little bit more about it, because echoes are one of the things that I find the most and spend the most time changing. Obviously, word echoes or specific phrases are a big one, but a lot of times authors will develop pet phrases or sentence structures that are their favorite to use. And I'm no exception. I read my own writing back out loud, or Word actually has a feature that you can have Word read it to you. And we joke a lot about the bestiary clause, the introduction that is really standard.
Initial participial clause.
Yes, thank you, James. Any introductory clause. There was one edit that I was making in the AP many months ago, where 4 sentences in a row started with "while something something something," And it just, or even if the word isn't while at the beginning of each sentence, there are just so many times that sentence structure can pop up. It's a very, succinct and useful way to convey information, especially when your word count's tight in an AP. But if you overuse it, it does start to stand out. So that's something that we look for a lot, and that also takes a lot of time, because then, instead of just using the words that you've given us, we have to start rewriting, which is not a big part of editing. Rewriting is kind of the last resort. So that's a great one to look for, and it is much easier to see. I also hear people talk about changing the font a lot for proofreading. I don't do that very often, but hearing it aloud is definitely helpful. I think just to get it.
This is maybe a good time to bring up that, if anybody has questions about how to improve their writing, or specific, quandaries that they've had while writing or while trying to proof their own work, please feel free to throw those in the chat, and we'll try and get to them at the end.
Yes, thank you. And also feel free, well, I won't speak for everyone, but feel free to find me online, either in the Discord or on Twitter, potentially my fellow panelists. I know we're all word nerds. We love talking about this. And part of the kind of bummer about the Paizo process is that, unlike if you were writing a novel, you can't go back and forth with your editor. You kind of just have to set it free and trust us to do our best with it. And that also means you don't really get a lot of feedback directly on your work, other than comparing your draft to what you've sent in. And devs do a lot of work on it, and editors do a lot of work on it, but we don't get to explain to you why. So it can be hard to grow as an editor or as a writer. So feel free to talk to us elsewhere if you like. Anyone else have anything they want to talk about elevating the material beyond like consistency and word choice?
Yeah, we have some. Why don't you go? Sorry.
Go ahead, Sol.
I'll say that one thing that always keeps in mind when it comes to elevating the material is to always keep in mind while you're reading through how it would feel to play and how it would feel to run, especially like as a GM. Because I know that some of the best ways that I found to elevate the material is just by occasionally going, now wait a second, where's the player logic here? What if the player does this? What if the player... It's not always something that happens. It comes up... Actually, you'd be surprised how rarely it actually comes up. But, it's common enough... It's not even... Rare is the wrong word, but it's common enough to just kind of think of the logic and occasionally pop in with a suggestion of, hey, maybe this could just adjust slightly with what a player might be expecting, or what a GM might be. This might be a little easier for a GM to run, or hey, what if the player decides to do this option? Maybe we should offer a suggestion for what the GM could go with that suggestion. That can be. I find that's a big part when it comes to elevating specifically game material as opposed to anything else.
Yes, absolutely. James, what did you want to...
The kind of fun part about RPGs is that there isn't really like a script that isn't really programmed out. Like the party really could go anywhere or do anything at any time, as I'm sure all of us have either inflicted on a GM or had to quickly improv around. And so that idea of like leaving the door open to creative solutions in the writing is one way to certainly keep that open as you're writing a story. And then in terms of editing specifically, you can kind of look at what the author is trying to get across. Like, what is the tone of this? And is this whimsical? Is this kind of gripping? Is this, does this spend like a lot of time describing like the lush ruins that the party is moving through in kind of a melancholic way? And so, kind of the first part of editing anything is just to kind of take it in and be like, okay, what's the vibe? What's going on here? And then how can I take that and execute it better? Because, if you get something in that's like, really gripping horror and you edit it really, really well, but you also kind of make it very like humorous, you've kind of changed the direction of the original. And so you really want to take whatever's there and just hone it up rather than kind of bending the direction, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. The goal of editing is to preserve the author's voice, right? Like, we aren't the ones writing or telling the story. Our goal is to support what the author has written. There is a little bit of extra layers to that when you're specifically looking at RPGs, because we are trying to blend multiple authors into one piece, and we need to follow Paizo's style and tone. But yeah, James is absolutely correct. Like, the overall intent is a big part of that. And editing does come in many levels. In our industry, we kind of do all of them. But developers are doing more of the big picture. What is the tone? What is the goal? What emotions and sensory details are we trying to evoke in players and GMs? And what do we want to offer our GMs to kind of set the scene? And then by the time that it gets to, Patrick Soule, myself, and our colleagues, we're really looking like line by line at the technical pieces and the word choice and how the sentences flow. And then we finally do, proofreading passes at the end. So there's so many layers to this. The only other thing that I had to add for elevating the prose is thinking about stronger phrasing. And we've talked about this already a little bit. But one of the examples that I usually point to is of even a short phrase like the freeing of Galt. That might be perfect. That might be exactly what you want to say in that moment. So there's nothing wrong with that. But another maybe punchier option could be Galt's liberation. So you can always kind of think about how are your phrases lining up. Maybe this is a place where you want something longer and simpler. Maybe you want to shorten it elsewhere. Neither one is wrong. So that's the art of editing, is figuring out which one suits your needs at any moment. I also want to make sure that we talk about conscious language, which that kind of blends right into. So, Sol, if you want to start it all talking about inclusivity and how we choose our words very intentionally.
Yeah. I think the most important thing with inclusivity, the thing that keeps people most grounded, is just to be kind of self-aware. Like, wherever you're coming from when it comes to your own position of, whatever your own history is, whatever your own privilege, whatever status is, it's the most important thing is just kind of to be aware of where you're coming from, where other people are coming from, and what's just what the language is. It can be. It's one of the things that you have to be conscious of, and it's a deliberate thing that you have to work at. But it is important, and it is honestly very fulfilling. It can be. It can really be part of the elevating of the text quite a bit, to just be conscious of not just the language, but the way that certain things are, the way that the stories, sometimes the way that the stories are structured, the way that certain tropes are used, the way that certain characters are presented. Sometimes we wind up getting like the way the way certain art pieces get presented, and also how those things get. This doesn't come up so much with self-editing, but when you're working in a team, how to bring those situations up with the writer or the developer gently, and talk this out without being accusing. It's all just it's several different factors that you have to keep in mind, but it all starts with being aware of just kind of keeping yourself focused and aware of everything that's going on, and working with intention of just keeping an open mind, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things that Sol brought up there was the idea of, being aware of like tropes in the kind of genre that you're writing with. Whereas, say like Pathfinder, at least, like this is a heroic fantasy game. So these are the kind of tropes that have come up in this situation. We have farm boy with magic sword. We have evil wizard in a tower. These are the kind of tropes that play within this space. And so first being aware of them, but I think also, I think one of what we mean by conscious and inclusive language has a lot to do with, you want anybody who is reading this story to feel like they could be the hero of the story. I mean, in the case of, we're making a heroic fantasy game here, right? And a lot of that comes down to like, does the writing implicitly make assumptions about the character for any reason? And that could be, and some of these times the assumptions are fine, assuming that the wizard can cast magic is perfect. That's perfectly fine to do. But if, for instance, one of the things we do a lot at Paizo has to do with gender-neutral language, for instance. We don't really say words like, watchman or, fireman, that kind of thing, because, in our setting, the town watch really just has people of any gender in it. It's not like a definitionally male thing. And so, if we say watchman, that's kind of an assumption that has reached the text that doesn't really need to be there, and kind of just maybe creates a slight pressure if you want to be playing a woman character who is like the captain of the town guard or something.
Yep, exactly. And I can say, as a woman who's been in gaming and reading fantasy for a long time, it definitely has a tone of exclusion to it when you immediately read something like that doesn't need to be there. And so that's a really big thing that you can look through in your work. And all of us have assumptions. All of us are coming from different cultural backgrounds where things, we're not used to examining them, and we forget that people come with other lenses. And so it's a really big piece of what we do as Paizo editors, and of what you can do if you're writing for us or for other games, is to just keep your audience in mind at all times. Like James said, like, we want anybody to pick this up and see themselves as the hero if that's what they're going for. And so starting from an open and welcoming space with the words that we use has a really big impact. It can seem small, it can seem insignificant. I could spend hours talking about this, but you always see people saying like, oh, well, we know like guardsman could mean anybody. Yeah, but there's always a but there. And so that's one of the things that we look for. And also the assumptions you make on who's doing what, like which ancestry or which gender is your guard or your mayor. I could spend a whole hour talking just about the decisions in Stardew Valley and all of the professions and genders and how those all mapped out. And so, that isn't everybody's cup of tea, but that is something that we look for, do you have a balance across genders of NPCs in the adventure you turned over, but your doctor, your engineer, your scientist, your captain of the guard are all male, and your front desk receptionist is female? Like, you're kind of bringing in some unnecessary gender stereotypes to this, and that's a case where editors would come in and make some adjustments. Anybody else want to jump in? Patrick, anything else to add?
Well, so hopefully developers would come in before us and make adjustments. True. But
yep.
I mean, to me, it's just like anything else. You want something to be as good as it can be, and you should approach, I think the best freelancers approach their work a little bit, even experienced ones, with a bit of a beginner's mindset or open mindset, because there's always something you can learn. There's always something that could make it better. So if you do have a blind spot, ask someone else, do some research. There's, I'm hesitant to say, we hire sensitivity readers as necessary, but I'm not going to tell freelancers to do that. But it's not the worst thing in the world. I think always being open to feedback from other people, and being genuine in the way that you seek feedback and receive it. Assume good intent, I think, is like, I mean, honestly, in our office, that's, I think, the thing that smooths over any time we've had to like figure out like, a way to not necessarily address something that's like, super problematic, because I think at this point people know that stuff won't fly at Paizo, but like just make something a little better. The base assumption, I think Saul was kind of saying this, of like good intent goes a long way when you're talking with all parties involved. So yeah, assuming good intent, do your research, realize that anything, I mean, hell, like any I've seen first drafts of like famous authors, and anything can always be improved.
Yes, for
All
sure.
of our first drafts never make it out.
Right.
We really
Thank the
want,
gods.
because I mean, sometimes I write something and I'm just like, yeah, that felt good. When I turn it in, I come back and I was like, I literally don't understand what this feat is supposed to be doing, and I made it up. So there's a little bit of talk in the chat that I think is a part of inclusive writing that is a little more unique to fantasy, which is the idea that, speculative fiction in general, but certainly fantasy, often has the idea of fantasy races much more front and center than some other genres, and how you talk about your ancestors or your species, even beyond kind of the word that you're kind of using to describe it is important, but is in some ways kind of the least important part about writing this. A lot of times you see a situation where, say, you have a setting, and in the setting, elves have sapience, they have society, they have moral complexity and all that kind of thing. So elves functionally have all the status of people, right? They're people. But you might see something like humans are diverse, and humans can be of kind of any background. They can have kind of any philosophy, but all elves do this in that kind of way. And what you've sort of done there is you've ascribed one sort of personality or one very stereotyped series of traits. And those can be positive or negative stereotypes, but like at the end of the day, you're still kind of restricting the stories you can tell with them. And so in terms of just kind of some like really what are some quick and dirty ways you can check for this in your writing, substitute anytime you're talking about an ancestry in your head with human, and substitute anytime you're talking about a culture with whatever your personal culture is. So the line like something like, the orcs are big and strong and terrifying to behold is like the Americans or the humans. And like you hear that, and that like that marks it as an outgroup, you can tell I'm like, well, I wouldn't say all humans are big and strong and terrible to behold. So like you can maybe find a way to be like, well, it's not because they're all orcs, it's because this is like the strongest, knight or something, and she's 9 feet tall and has tusks and wields a broadsword and that kind of thing. I'm like, well, then you're just describing one person, right? That makes a lot of sense.
Or one
So, yeah.
small subgroup having those values specifically or something. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, substitute in human, substitute in the name of your hometown, and you will be surprised at how much you can kind of catch.
And then on the flip side of that, when you're actually getting the text done, one thing that, especially when I'm doing Starfinder, one of the things to keep an eye on is to avoid things like talking about human nature and talking about describing things when you're trying to talk about people as talking about not just men, but talking about humans. Humankind, human nature, because there's a tendency to be almost human-centric and to make assumptions that like what's standard for humans is standard for everybody. Even in Starfinder, where you've got creatures who are, some of the species are like floating jellyfish and sea slugs and all these kind of business. So it's like keeping human-centric language out of the science fiction, the science fantasy settings will just make your settings that much stronger,
Yeah, exactly. I could talk about conscious language and different fantasy groups for several more hours also, but I do want to keep us moving because maybe we can have a subsequent panel on that at another time, or find us after this. I will say just before we move on that the Conscious Language Style Guide is a great resource if you're wondering about language choices in general and how you can kind of expand your perspective. And there's also a organization called Writing the Other, and they have really wonderful workshops, often with scholarships available, to discuss how to write people unlike yourself, which is really handy if you're writing about ancestries that don't even exist in real life, and are wanting to make them fully realized individuals with their own personalities instead of just like a really kind of minimized group. So those are great places to start, and there are a lot more resources that can take you from there. More on self-editing, to kind of get back to the technical side of things. You may or may not be familiar with style guides, which, there's the Chicago Manual of Style, which is what print publications like Paizo uses. And it is off screen right now, but it's about 800 pounds. There is an online version, but that covers punctuation usage and syntax and all sorts of ways that we use language. And then you have guides like the AP Style Guide, which journalists use. They are anti-Oxford or serial comma, as one example. But there's a lot of
I know,
we don't
all
talk
of the
about the
editors
AP
immediately
stuff.
provoked a strong emotional reaction.
Boo! But just because there are a lot of decisions that you can make about how to use the English language, and so there are very standard guides that everybody kind of agrees to follow. So again, we use the Chicago style. You do not need to go out and spend $65 on this book or get a subscription online, but you can look at some free resources if you want to be kind of a step above as a writer for us, or for whatever game you're writing for. Just be familiar with some of the very basics and stick to those in your submissions, because we'll notice. But don't feel like you have to be a master, because that's what we are here to do. So it's totally okay if you're not a pro at that. But underneath the style guide, obviously Paizo has a house style that covers a lot of internal stuff for our game. And we also recommend for editors, but also when you're writing, whether it's a novel or a game, to keep a style sheet for that game. So instead of the large book that covers every case, this is something where you would be writing down the names of the NPCs that you're making up and the towns, maybe some key descriptive information, like what color eyes a character has, or what direction the road goes, so that you can make sure that you're staying consistent, like we talked about earlier. So one of the biggest things we see, besides those echoes and patterns that we talked about earlier, is discrepancies in the spelling of new names that have been made up, especially if we're going from product to product. That gets really hard to track down. And plurals, sometimes using an irregular plural, and sometimes adding that S to the end of a made-up word. So keeping track of things like that as you're writing reduces the errors that devs and editors will need to find or verify down the road. And Sol, I don't know if there's anything that you want to jump in on from there, either org play specific or just in general, with style sheets in general. And if not, that's okay.
Honestly, no, you covered it. All I had to say was this is what you're looking for when it comes to Chicago, for the record.
Yes.
There's
this monster.
That is kind of true, though, because, we don't write in, like, standard American English. We have things like, we decided that magic would be italicized. That's not how you write in the newspaper, but that's a specific style for, the brand. And that's kind of, at the end of the day, you want to be following kind of the grammar because it serves a function in your writing, because it, makes it clearer, or because it's important to your brand, whether that's the brand that you are freelancing for, or if that's like your own thing you're writing. Like, if we italicize all of our magic items, if your setting doesn't have a lot of magic in it, but you have something else that format might be more useful for, then do that. That will be if that's the way that the grammar can most clearly communicate that, and you are not following, a company's style that kind of has that set, because that company has already sort of, made trying to go for that consistency, you can do that. People bring this up, but like sometimes you do bend the rule a little bit in the service of the final product, and that's fine if done intentionally and judiciously and not too much. So.
That's actually something. Go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, what James just said kind of made me think of something that I had been noodling with for the last few minutes. Was like, I think sometimes you want your thing to be, first of all, you want to have fun. the people who are playing the games want to have fun, but you should have fun writing it. Like there should be a part where you're like, oh, that was really cool. Oh my gosh. I think sometimes when we're editing or you're applying rules to things, there's people you could get trapped in a like, well, I can't have fun because I have to follow the rules, or there's like a binary, and it's a false dichotomy. I think there's not like, oh, this can be awesome, or this can be sensitively written, or oh, this could be awesome, or this could be conforming to house style. I assure you it's possible to do both. And like, so, you know, in your first drafts, just go nuts. Like, and then you take all of that beautiful creativity and then edit it with sensitivity, with a style guide, applying Chicago manual style and our own house style. And you combine those two things, and I swear developers will come back to you all the time with more work. Like, that's like the key. I think if you can you know, have fun and pour some passion into it, follow that rule of cool, and then get some distance, and that's when you kind of all of a sudden, you know, apply the logic, make it better. So anyway, I was just thinking about that because I think sometimes whenever I've seen speed bumps or and this is just in fiction writing outside of work, it's because people are assuming like, oh, well, I won't be able to like make this beautiful, and if I have to follow all these rules or anything. And I think I'd like to encourage any prospective writers who are looking to edit themselves that it's not a binary all or nothing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that can be really hard to turn off your editing brain while you're writing, if you are familiar with a lot of the rules. And I know I struggle with it a lot. I'm like, well, I already know how to, precisely use all this punctuation, and I get so wrapped up in like crafting the perfect sentence that I get nowhere. And you really need to just set that aside, write, get some space from it, and then come back. And that's one of the things I recommend too with reading it aloud. If you can build some time into your writing window before your turnover is due, to step away from what you've written for a couple of days, come back with fresh eyes, read it out loud. That's when the editing can come in, as opposed to stressing about all of these details while you're getting words on the page. That part has to come first. James, were you going to add something too?
Yeah, I'm just saying I hate writing by hand. I absolutely hate it. And all of my primary writing is in like a little notebook in a pen because it removes the Control-Z and the backspace keys from my toolkit. And then I just have to write a terrible first draft. But then once I have done the first draft, I'm just like, okay, mode change. Now we can go into editing it. And trying to do everything at once is folly. Write a bad first draft. Just do it. It will be bad. That is as it should be. And then you can go in and tune it up. Be like, oh, well, I want this character to be a little more interesting here, or like, oh, I think this ability can do a little less damage there, but maybe I'll get this condition. But you can't edit anything until it's on the page. So when I'm just sitting there at the keyboard, I'm like, type to type, delete, type to type, Control-Z. That's not productive.
Yes, absolutely. I want to talk about one more piece of self-editing that we haven't covered yet, which is maps. A lot of people who write APs for us are also drafting maps. Does anyone want to talk at all about editing a map? Even though most of that happens in-house, the stronger map you turn over, the better. Sol, I know you've caught a lot on some of the maps that have come in. Do you have any advice on that? Or common errors that you see?
Honestly, the most straightforward thing with a map is to just have it with you while you're going through the portion of whatever story or adventure the map is referring to. Always have the map just available to reference while you're reading the part that the map is referring to, and be able to just check and make sure that everything that needs to be there is there. That is the best way to catch discrepancies up to and including. I have stumbled across maps that have been missing entire walls. I've stumbled across maps that have had traps that are mislaid in the wrong places. It's very easy to get miscommunications between things, and that's part of the job. So it's don't be afraid to when you're editing. One of the best things to do is to be able to just take whatever document you're working on apart and spread the pages out and just work on the different pages and being able to reference them. If you're an editor, if you're working digitally, you are going to want two screens to work digitally, and you're going to want to be able, at least, you're going to want to be able to reference things and be able to move them around and be able to just compare things side to side, because that is absolutely the best way to catch when you've got a discrepancy between not just the map, but also like appendices if you're trying to, or page numbers. Best way to catch everything like that.
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
For sure.
One of the one of the volumes of the Fist of the Ruby Phoenix, I think it was the second or maybe it was the first. I think it had. So I guess my caution would be, if you're making maps, the more locations you include, the more things we will be checking. And I remember once checking like 70 locations, or it was something like that, in one of the Ruby Phoenix APs. I think it was on the island, and it was really interesting. It was a cool dynamic because what it meant was, like, the way it was set up was that, like, different encounters could happen in totally different places as the party wandered the island, fighting different groups and finding different treasures or encountering different creatures. It was awesome. It was also a lot to check, and I think I remember I did find like one area that was spelled inconsistently, like on the map and then in the text. But, and one actually out of 70 is great. But the more locations you have, and this is not to say don't have a lot of locations in your map, but just be aware that, like, that means you're going to be checking a lot more. And that just will add on. And I think, so I always, when I'm editing and have a map part of an encounter, I usually do like a snippet, just so I could put a copy of the map, like Saul says, on the other screen. But, be aware that, like, adding tons of different locations to the map increases the complexity. And, ask yourself, do I need 70 different ones?
I think since we're coming into the last few minutes here, we'll try and take a look at some of the questions that have come in. And please feel free to post any final thoughts that you have in there. We'll try to get to everything that we can. One of the first questions I saw was about different writing styles, and if some work better than others for writing RPGs. So I don't know if that was your question, if you want to add any context to some of the styles that you're thinking about, but otherwise, I'm going to let this part kind of be a free-for-all, so anybody who wants to jump in on that, please feel free.
I would say, like, we use Chicago because it's just kind of it's a little more technical, I think, without being too really, like, I used to work in medical editing, and you things can get very technical there, and I don't think we need that level of complication. That's a really good one, but there's totally times it's makes a lot of sense to do things differently. I know Monsters of Myth, Jake Chandro did a lore thing all in, like, old English or possibly Norse, I forget which, poetry, and so, like, that's obviously, like, it serves a purpose to suspend your style there. So just looking at, when does it serve the story?
Yes, yeah. It's important to have a base to choose from. So with games publishing, that's probably going to be Chicago. But that's why, there's kind of that umbrella, but then we do have a Paizo house style. And I know people have asked for it, and I would love to have a public facing style guide someday, but it is very large and not prepared for public consumption. But we have things that are contra Chicago in there that we as a publishing house decide to do differently. And so your own indie games or other publishers that you work for probably have something similar, where there are specific things either that Chicago doesn't address, or that, for whatever purpose, there's a different way that we like to do it. Same with dictionaries. Not all dictionaries are the same. There's differences between UK and Canadian English versus American English. And so making sure that, for example, we usually say, okay, we use, Merriam-Webster's, and we use the first instance of the spelling if it lists two variants. So you can get really detailed in that. But it's really just making sure, if you're deciding that for your own products, that you pick one and stay consistent to it. And if you're writing for a company, to get that information from them so that you can follow their guidelines as much as possible. Any other thoughts on writing styles, Patrick?
I guess this is more of a substantive style thing, but one thing I would encourage freelancers, you're writing a work for hire to a word count, and sometimes subconsciously, I think that can encourage overwordiness, just so you can meet the word count. And that's not, we're just going to cut it. So I would, if you're doing a list of possible professions of an NPC, you don't have to include 12 examples. You can include 3 very good ones. We try to be very expansive in our descriptions sometimes, but I've noticed that there are sometimes where they can be a little overly expansive. Like, we don't have to count, well, there's a bed here, there's a lamp here, there's a thing there. You could just say, this is a living room, typical of a Absalonian style or something like that. So you do have to hit your word counts, but I think try to hit them by being as concise and clear as possible is a good metric.
Yes.
Then you have more room to put in that last cool spell you didn't have room for.
That's right. One of the questions was about finding plot holes, because players can kind of do whatever they want. I have not written adventures, so if anybody else who has or who develops them wants to talk a little bit about that, please do.
This is something, yeah. When I was, because I was a developer in organized play, where you really want to make sure that the adventures run that way at the table. This gets a little into the design and less so the writing, but you kind of want to always ensure that, like, okay, here's the puzzle. There's a door and it's locked. So what's the most obvious thing? They might try to, pick the lock. Cool. They might try to find the key. Cool. They might try to break the door down. Cool. So you've kind of covered your main ones. And you just want to be sure that, like, you've given this other kind of option. Like, if the party has some other way to bypass the door, give them a +2 on the check if they have maybe some sort of, like, chemical, say if they have, like, an alchemist or something, or basically just find a way to reward the player's problem solving. Like, if you didn't realize one of the players was going to be a ghost and they can just ghost walk through the door, that's cool. Like, that's not a failure of the adventure. That's like a cool complication that they came up with, and just be like, just give them the tools. Like, it's a door, it's made of normal wood, and it's you can look up the stats for that if you want to, but you probably don't need them, right? It's just there.
Yeah.
And that's very hand in hand with the, like, kind of fallback option. Like, imagine nobody has lockpicking, nobody knows what the concept of a key is, and everybody has noodly arms and they can't push the door down. And, like, there's nothing they can do. And you can just say, like, after 3 failed checks, the guards on the other side are like, sounds like somebody's trying to break in, and then they open the door. And, like, you still failed. Like, now maybe they get a bonus on initiative to fight you because they saw you coming because you were banging on the door. But you haven't prevented the story from going forward. Like, at the end of the day, the door is open. The party is in a little bit of worse position because they failed the check, and the contract is when you roll a 1, that should be bad for you. But the story can move forward. So just kind of keep that sort of escape clause in, and that'll work. Or it'll get it at least close enough that the GM, because the GM is interpreting the rules, will know how to take it from there.
Yeah, that's great. We can't cover all our bases, or our APs would be they'd be bigger than the Chicago manual style. So at some point you have to trust the GM. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have another question here in our last couple of minutes about services like Grammarly, if they will help or hinder writing for RPGs. I have not used it personally, so I'm not really sure how much it helps. I think there's a chance that you could kind of get too sucked into doing everything perfectly and have that sap your creativity a little bit. So like we talked about before, I would say write your draft, and then if you come up with a specific question, you can refer to something like that, or other writing guides. But I would try not to do it simultaneously, or set time aside to familiarize yourself with some of the basic sentence constructions or grammar things that you often have trouble with, and kind of use it as a supplement, but not trying to get too into, you are a writer primarily if you're writing for us, so it doesn't need to be perfectly edited, and kind of just use it as needed. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that too.
My general rule is use whatever tools work for you to get your words on the page for the most part, but I would caution against using too many actual AI tools like that, because the writing that I have read from people who rely too much on those kinds of tools that are meant to analyze and supposedly make writing easier tend to come out very mechanical and stale.
Mm-hmm.
And it's honestly, if you they can be useful to an extent, but if you lean too much on them, it can be an active detriment to your writing. So be careful is what I would say. Is they have their uses, but you don't want to use them as a crutch.
Yes. Yeah, you will not develop a unique author voice if you're using that, and that will come across in your work, and will probably reduce the amount of opportunities you get in the future. Go ahead.
And quite frankly, we write in a very specialized style, and any of these tools are trained on kind of a general use model. And even I, first off, completely agree with Saul, and highly specific tool. I will take the screwdriver out specifically for using the screwdriver, but I won't attempt to use this massive toolkit to do kind of everything, because then you're kind of losing the thread on it a bit. But also these things are not really designed for the kind of very specialized writing that we do, where we're writing about evocative fantasy, but also there's language for checks coming in the middle. And so it's honestly just more likely to introduce errors, I think.
And even if you did have access to a tool that was that specialized, it would go against our anti-AI policy anyway. So
yeah,
sure.
Maybe no.
We're not hiring the AI to write for us. We're hiring you your words. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Any further thoughts on editing in general or writing for us? We got 1 minute left. I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we're in a good spot. Thank you all so much. It was really fun to get to talk about this. All of us, except Patrick, I think, do have AMA channels in the Discord, so you're welcome to come find us there. Otherwise, stay tuned. I think BCom Studios is up next. And yeah, thanks. Enjoy the rest of your con.